Now we move to the next speaker, and now that we have talked about innovation, we have talked about policy making and political leadership, I'm sure many of you have heard or read some articles about the potential of seaweed as a contributor to the fight against climate change. And so we are now delighted to have Alexandra Cousteau with us, who is the founder of Oceans 2050. And with this organization, Alexandra has just started, I think, a very unique in terms of ambition, size, and scope of work, really unique project to provide some scientific answers on what is the real role of seaweed in carbon sequestration, how can we quantify that, and how can we in the longer term turn that into carbon credits. Alexandra, the floor is yours. We'd love to hear where you are at with Ocean 2050 on answering these kind of burning questions that many people are wondering about.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Yeah, so Oceans 2050 is a relatively new initiative for us. We started just a few years ago, and it was really born from my realization that after having spent my entire life, from the time I was a baby, as part of this ocean community, the oceans were still experiencing loss year after year after year, in spite of my grandfather and my father's contributions to articulating this conservation ethic for the oceans back in the 60s. And so I realized that this is a moment before we reach some critical tipping points in the next 10 years from which it will be hard to come back, that we start reevaluating how we articulate our ambitions for the ocean. In a lot of meetings with ministers and high-level decision makers, I kept hearing this term sustainable exploitation. And it worried me because it felt a lot like all the mistakes that we've already made on land. And that for the oceans, we needed a different pathway, like a clearly defined different pathway that had clear measurements of success, a clear vision for the future, and a clear outcome. And that can't be business as usual, and it can't be sustaining the half of the ocean that we have left. It started to feel really critical that we start talking about rebuilding marine biodiversity, restoring ocean abundance, regenerating what we've lost. So Oceans 2050 took a look at the science by our chief scientist, Professor Carlos Duarte, that was published in Nature last May. And that lays out really a roadmap for rebuilding marine biodiversity by 2050 to the abundance that my grandfather knew back in the 50s and 60s. And that personally was really exciting to me because I have this nightmare that my children will be the generation of my family to write the obituary for the ocean. And so Oceans 2050, as its name implies, is about doing the things that need to be done to put us on a new solutions pathway with restoration of abundance as, our yardstick for success that brings net positives to the ocean every year, and that we can reverse this downward spiral that we've been in year after year after year for the past decades. And we saw seaweed really as one of those catalysts that could help us leapfrog into an abundant future. And what we wanted to do was really help to position seaweed as a foundational part of a regenerative blue economy, and felt that in order to do that and in order to scale it, we needed to help create a market around seaweed that would be compensating the seaweed farmers, not for exploitation, but for carbon sequestration and a host of other benefits. So we started from the premise that healthy, biodiverse ocean ecosystems are good for the climate. They maintain their own carbon balance and often sequester carbon. And restoring ocean abundance is a key component of restoring balance to the atmosphere and restoring the carbon balance to the oceans. And those two are connected. So keep in mind that we're putting the heat equivalent of 5 Hiroshima bombs into the ocean every second right now. And our oceans have absorbed 30% of excess CO2 that humans have emitted to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So the way that carbon balances work, whenever we're successful at lowering atmospheric levels of CO2, that excess CO2 in the ocean will just bubble back into the atmosphere. It's sort of like paying back a loan. So if we don't do something for the oceans, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. And I think prolonging that period of time that we'll be experiencing climate disruptions to our planet. So there are a number of different ideas about how to restore CO2 balance to the oceans. We felt that macroalgae is by far the most doable because it's already widespread in practice. And it's a nature-based solution that's more likely to get widespread support since it doesn't involve what some might consider to be geoengineering. Seaweed farming is viable today, as we've already heard. It's doable today. It's generating revenue today, and there's room to scale it up dramatically. So currently, it's just under 2,000 square kilometers that are under cultivation in the ocean, that seaweed farms are cultivating. And we believe we can expand that to 3.5 million square kilometers while still only relying on the excess nutrients from anthropogenic sources. So it won't be competing with the nutrients that are needed by other ecosystems. Now, macroalgae has 3 levels of potential climate impacts. 2 are mitigation, and 1 is climate adaptation. So climate mitigation benefits are carbon removal during the growing process, and then avoided emissions for whatever you use the biomass for. For example, using plastics made out of seaweed instead of plastics made out of oil and gas, or using seaweed for activities that result in the avoidance of methane emissions. And so that could be feed for ruminants or enhancing the carbon content of soil by applying biostimulants. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is evaluating the carbon removal of seaweed just by growing it. So 2 things to remember about that. Removal means that it's permanently sequestered. That has to be to a 50 or 100-year time frame, which we can do in the sediment beneath the seaweed farms. And number 2, anywhere you grow seaweed, as long as there are sediments in which you can trace the carbon impacts, you're removing carbon. So you don't have to change what you're doing with the biomass to have a carbon impact. And there's something else that's already been mentioned, but I just wanted to reiterate, which is that seaweed farms create local benefits in terms of reducing temperature, reversing acidification, which makes them more resilient to the impacts of climate change, and also providing coastal resilience, enhancing fisheries and biodiversity. And that's food security, but it's also broader benefits to the oceans. And then there's all of the social impacts, which are important, especially the fact that many, many, many women are employed at seaweed farms or own seaweed farms. And in our study that we're doing right now across 5 continents with 23 farms that represent over 20,000 farmers, most of those farmers are women. And I think that's part of what makes this such an exciting solution, especially in the way that it touches so many of the other SDG goals. So anyway, back to our study. Up to 50% of seaweed biomass breaks off during the growth period. And of that biomass that breaks off, it gets transported elsewhere in the environment. So some of it gets absorbed back into the environment, some of it gets buried permanently in the sediment under farms. And the challenge that we have with kelp forests or large offshore farms is that they're located in places with really active currents, and that the biomass that breaks off can end up to 5,000 kilometers away, which makes it hard to track back to the original seaweed source. So we can test it and find out that it's from macroalgal origin. And our chief scientist, Professor Carlos Duarte, did that in his study in the Red Sea that showed that 40% of carbon in sediments and seagrass meadows comes from algae. So we know that algae breaks off and carbon ends up elsewhere, but it's not currently feasible to track it like in a concentric circle of 5,000 kilometers to understand the carbon impact of each individual seaweed farm and be confident about which one it came from, unless there was a new species that was introduced that was found nowhere else around. So for our study, we're only looking at farms that have sediment underneath them and that are in relatively protected nearshore environments, because that gives us the certainty that the carbon in the sediments underneath the farms actually comes from the farm and not somewhere else. So our science is establishing the carbon impact with certainty required to monetize that impact and build a market around it today as a mechanism to help scale seaweed farming as a regenerative force for our ocean. And we feel like a new market for seaweed, which is carbon, to enhance the revenues of farmers and make sure they get monetized for their carbon impact, and also better understand the drivers of carbon sequestration by seaweed farms, is really important so that we know how to optimize farms for climate impact, which is going to let us scale up in a way that's profoundly impactful for a regenerative blue economy. And I just wanted to mention that we'll have our results to report in July in Monaco. The International Atomic Energy Agency is one of the laboratories that's doing the radiocarbon dating of our sediment. So that's where and when we expect to do the announcement of our results, COVID permitting, of course.